Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval banquet hall. Imagine the grandiose setting, with tapestries hanging from the walls, candlelight flickering in every corner, and the overwhelming aroma of roasted meats filling the air. You might be picturing a lavish feast, the kind that only kings and queens could indulge in. But guess what? You probably wouldn't survive this meal. The extravagance and weirdness of medieval diets are enough to leave you shaking your head. From exotic animals served on silver platters to the bizarre concoctions that were considered delicacies, the Middle Ages had a food scene that's as odd as it is fascinating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you take a seat at the long wooden table, think about the spread laid out before you. The centerpieces are far from what you'd expect in a modern banquet. Think roasted boar, peacock, and maybe even a few swans. Birds you probably didn't realize were considered a regular part of the medieval diet. But it wasn't just about eating what was available. Oh no, food in medieval times wasn't simply sustenance, it was status. The nobility had the best cuts, while the commoners were lucky to get a crust of bread. But even their bread wasn't so simple. Bread in the Middle Ages wasn't the fluffy, air-filled loaf we're used to today. It was dense, hard, and sometimes a little strange, especially when it came to how it was flavored. Did you know medieval bread could contain spices like saffron, pepper, or even crushed almonds? Of course, these feasts were not just about eating, they were about spectacle. The rich didn't just eat, they performed their wealth for all to see. Everything about the meal was designed to show off. And not just the food itself. Think about how it was served. A large roasted boar might be brought to the table, its mouth stuffed with apples, its eyes still intact as a symbol of the hunt. No, this wasn't your typical clean plate meal. The spectacle of it all was just as important as the food itself. Imagine the flurry of servants running back and forth, carrying massive platters, wine flowing from golden goblets, and a general atmosphere of excess. However, amid this show of luxury, there was a darker reality. The medieval period wasn't just about sumptuous feasts, it was also about survival. While the wealthy were indulging in these extravagant meals, the common folk were lucky to get enough to eat at all. Meat, if they could get it, was often salted or dried, to last through the long, harsh winters. It wasn't uncommon for the poor to go entire days without food. They were often left to subsist on a basic, gruel-like mixture of oats, barley, and whatever scraps they could get their hands on. As much as we romanticize these grand feasts, for many, food was a constant struggle. Historians still argue whether the lavish meals of the wealthy were a way to flaunt their power, or if they were simply a result of having an overabundance of food available. What we do know is that this disparity in food access had a profound impact on medieval society. But the differences in medieval diets weren't just about class, they were also about region. Depending on where you were in Europe, your diet could vary dramatically. In England, for example, wheat was a staple, while in other parts of Europe, barley and oats were more common. And don't get me started on the strange exotic foods that were imported through the spice trade, which we'll get into in the next section. Now that you've had a glimpse of the grand banquets, let's dive into one of the most intriguing parts of medieval diets, the meat. As you sit back at the table, a massive leg of mutton is brought before you, its steam rising in the cool medieval air. The scent of roasted meat fills your nose, but there's something peculiar about this feast. If you look closely, you'll see that the meat doesn't quite resemble the cuts you're used to today. It's fatty, gamey, and, more often than not, overcooked, yet still considered a delicacy. Medieval people didn't just eat meat as part of their regular diet, they worshipped it. The aristocracy especially believed that meat was a symbol of strength, power, and wealth. The rarer the meat, the higher your status. Venison, for example, was so coveted that hunting it was reserved only for the nobility. If a peasant even dared to hunt deer, it was considered a crime. But even more bizarre was the concept of exotic meats. Swans, peacocks, and even flamingos were all consumed in the medieval banquet halls, not just for their taste, but for the shock factor. Imagine the nobles sitting proudly as they enjoyed these majestic creatures, their eyes glistening as a roasted flamingo was set before them. Was it about the taste? Probably not. It was about showing the world just how far their wealth could extend. And then there's the case of dormice. Yes, you heard me right. Dormice. These small rodents were considered a delicacy during medieval times, especially in ancient Rome, and carried on through the Middle Ages. Dormice were stuffed with minced meat, rolled in spices, and roasted. But don't think that these dishes were made for just any occasion. Medieval feasts had very specific rules about which meat should be served for different events. For example, on religious fast days, eating meat was forbidden. But clever cooks found ways around it. They would serve fish as a substitute for meat, though it wasn't always what we consider fish. Some of these fish were so rich and oily that they might as well have been considered meat. Historians still argue whether the obsession with meat in medieval feasts was driven purely by a need for status, or if it was also a matter of survival. After all, meat was a symbol of abundance. If you could afford to eat meat regularly, you were certainly in a better position than those who could barely scrape together a meal. But at the same time, some of the meats that were consumed were incredibly unhealthy by today's standards. The excessive fat in game meat, along with the lack of proper refrigeration methods, often made the meat quite difficult to digest. And yet, it was considered luxurious. The medieval attitude toward meat wasn't just about taste. It was a reflection of the culture. Meat represented the very essence of power. The more rare the animal, the more it symbolized prestige. But did anyone stop to think about the long-term effects? It's hard to imagine a world in which the social status of your dinner plate could literally make or break your health. And this obsession with meat didn't just end with the noble class. It trickled down to the lower classes as well. For them, eating meat was a rarity, often reserved for special occasions or holidays. Meat was so prized that even scraps were eagerly fought over, and many commoners relied heavily on preserved meats like salted pork to survive. But if you think the story of medieval meat stops there, think again. The strange practices didn't just involve fancy birds or exotic creatures. They also had a tendency to take the meat part of a meal to extreme lengths. Next, we'll look at the fascinating world of medieval soups and stews, where things could get even stranger. As you lean in to examine the meal before you, the next course is brought out, an enormous pot of bubbling stew. Its contents are a mystery, with chunks of meat, grains, vegetables, and something that might be best described as whatever was available. This is medieval soup, a food that had both the practicality of a meal and the bizarre unpredictability of what was tossed into the pot. In the medieval world, soups and stews were the backbone of the common diet, but they also tell a fascinating story about the world's relationship with food. Imagine you're sitting at the table, stirring your bowl of broth. You might see a few familiar ingredients, some carrots, a handful of herbs, perhaps a potato. But underneath the surface, there are surprises. Is that a bit of old bread floating in your soup? Probably. In medieval times, bread wasn't just food. It was also used to thicken soups and stews. It was a clever way to stretch meals, especially when meat was in short supply. But medieval soups weren't just for poor peasants. They were eaten by all classes, albeit in different forms. Nobles, for instance, might have had stews made with expensive cuts of meat, while peasants relied on more basic, root vegetables. Stews also served as a kind of culinary insurance policy. If you had an abundance of meat, you could cook it up in a stew to preserve it for later. You might toss in grains, beans, and any other scraps, letting it simmer for hours or even days. By the time you were ready to eat it, the flavors had melded together into a hearty dish that could feed an entire family. But while these stews were practical, they were also strange. For example, medieval stews often included a mix of ingredients that, by modern standards, seem almost random. A single pot could contain pork, fish, and vegetables all in one go. Was this an effort to make sure nothing went to waste? Historians still argue whether this was just about practicality, or if medieval cooks were simply indulging in the habit of mixing everything together for flavor or nutrition. But let's talk about the weirdest part: the medieval habit of putting almost anything into these stews. Leftover meat? Toss it in. A handful of herbs from the garden? Sure, why not? Oh, and don't forget the spices. Pepper, saffron, and cinnamon were used frequently, not just for flavor, but for medicinal purposes too. Back then, food wasn't just for eating. It was thought to have healing powers. Many people believed that spices could cure ailments like indigestion or even the common cold. While we might be skeptical today, medieval people took their spices seriously, believing they had life-saving qualities. They would often sprinkle them into stews and soups to improve health, often to the detriment of taste. Historians still debate how common it was for medieval cooks to make these odd, multi-ingredient stews. Were they merely making use of available resources, or was there an intentional effort to create a dish that could represent the complexity and richness of the age? Some even suggest that stews were designed as an antidote to the monotony of medieval eating, an attempt to create something flavorful from what might otherwise be a dull mix of ingredients. Of course, the reality is that these stews weren't always the gourmet dishes we imagine. Often they were simply an efficient way to feed a family or a crowd with whatever was at hand. But despite their practicality, these medieval soups were more than just functional. In some cases, they were a social experience. Serving up a communal stew was a way to bring people together, whether at a noble feast or in a small peasant hut. As you sit back from the table, you can almost hear the chatter and laughter that would have filled the air around these meals. The preparation of these stews wasn't just about cooking, it was about bonding, and even a bit of storytelling. Families would gather around, sharing tales while stirring the pot. It was an essential part of social life in medieval times, despite the strange combinations that made up the dish. Now, if medieval soups and stews seem a little strange, you won't be surprised to hear that the spices used in these dishes were often as odd as the recipes themselves. In our next section, we'll look at the fascinating world of medieval spices and how the spice trade influenced the flavor of European cuisine, and perhaps even the course of history itself. As the last remnants of stew are cleared away, the next course arrives, and it's something that's sure to catch your attention: spices. A small bowl filled with exotic, colorful powders sits on the table before you. Saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper. Ingredients that, in the medieval world, were far more than just flavoring agents. They were treasures, worth more than their weight in gold, and their presence on your table is a sign of power, wealth, and access to far-flung trade routes. You might find it surprising to learn that medieval European cuisine, especially in the wealthier households, wasn't as bland as you might expect. Thanks to the burgeoning spice trade, Medieval cooks had access to a dazzling array of spices imported from the East. Pepper, which today is practically ubiquitous, was considered a luxury, a symbol of status. In fact, pepper was so valuable that it was often used as currency. Imagine paying your taxes with bags of peppercorns or using them to settle debts. Pepper wasn't just about flavor. It was a prized commodity, a symbol of the global trade networks that were beginning to stretch across the world. Saffron was another luxury spice, and it wasn't just for flavoring rice. It was used in soups, sauces, and even desserts. Medieval people believed that saffron had healing properties, and it was often used in remedies for various ailments. Cinnamon, too, was highly prized, often added to stews and baked goods to give them a rich, aromatic sweetness. In fact, many medieval recipes called for a combination of spices that, to modern sensibilities, seem a bit strange. Can you imagine eating a meat pie filled with a blend of cinnamon, cloves, and pepper? It was common in the Middle Ages, and not just in sweet dishes. The use of spices in savory foods was part of the medieval obsession with creating complex, layered flavors. But what made the spice trade so significant wasn't just the impact on food. Spices had a direct influence on the course of history. The demand for spices drove European exploration during the Age of Discovery. It's not an exaggeration to say that spices were among the first commodities to spark European colonial expansion. The quest for pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon led to the establishment of powerful trading empires, the discovery of new lands, and ultimately, the colonization of vast regions. Historians still debate whether the quest for spices was the driving force behind European exploration, or if it was simply one of many motivations. But one thing's for sure, spices weren't just flavoring the meals, they were shaping the world. The influence of spices on medieval cuisine wasn't limited to the wealthy elite. Even commoners could get in on the action, though they didn't have the luxury of paying exorbitant prices for their seasonings. Instead, they relied on a more modest selection of local herbs and spices, like garlic, onions, and mustard. But even these humble ingredients were valued for their flavor and medicinal properties. Garlic was believed to ward off evil spirits, while mustard was used to stimulate the appetite and aid digestion. Still, the wealthier classes had the true spice advantage. Spices were an essential part of any medieval banquet. The more exotic the spice, the higher the status of the host, and the effects were far-reaching. Imagine a grand banquet table set with silver plates, surrounded by a dozen different types of meat, all infused with spices from far-off lands. To the nobility, it wasn't just about the food, it was about showing off their access to these luxuries, signaling to everyone that they were part of a global network of trade and power. Historians still argue about the true extent of the spice trade's impact on medieval society. Was it purely a luxury for the rich, or did it also have practical uses for the everyday person? Some believe that the medicinal properties of spices were key to their popularity among common folk. Others claim that spices were merely a status symbol for the elite, a way for the rich to display their wealth and influence. Whatever the case, spices were not just a fleeting trend in medieval diets. They were an integral part of the cultural and economic landscape of the time. But as we leave the world of spices behind, we'll move on to something a little more sweet. In the next section, we'll explore the sugary side of medieval diets and how the medieval sweet tooth evolved in a world that had no candy stores or chocolate bars. As the last of the savory dishes are cleared away, your attention turns to something sweet, perhaps a small golden pastry or a bowl of syrupy fruits. You might be thinking, hold on, isn't sugar a modern luxury? But in the medieval world, sugar was a much coveted ingredient, and the idea of satisfying a sweet tooth was just as real as it is today. Of course, the sweet treats of medieval Europe were very different from the chocolates and candies we indulge in now. Instead, they were made from honey, fruits, and a variety of syrups, some of which had medicinal properties. Medieval sweets weren't as easy to come by as they are in our modern supermarkets. Honey was the primary sweetener available to most people, and it was used in everything from cakes and pastries to drinks. But honey was expensive. It wasn't something the average person could afford to use liberally. It was often reserved for special occasions like feasts, religious ceremonies, or for the wealthier classes. But it wasn't just used for flavoring food. It had practical uses as well. Honey was believed to have medicinal properties and was often used in remedies for everything from sore throats to digestive problems. It was even used as a base for alcoholic beverages, like mead, which was especially popular in Northern Europe. Still, honey had its limits, and for those who could afford it, sugar became the ultimate luxury. The sugary treats that graced the tables of the nobility were extravagant, often featuring complex combinations of honey, sugar, and exotic fruits. Medieval sugar was derived from sugar cane, and it wasn't quite the fine white powder we know today. Instead, it came in large, raw chunks that needed to be carefully processed. But for the wealthy, sugar was a status symbol as much as a sweetener. It wasn't just about flavoring food, it was about showing off wealth. When sugar was introduced to Europe from the Middle East, it quickly became a symbol of opulence and power. The more sugar you could afford, the more luxurious your meals appeared. And this wasn't just limited to desserts. Sugar was sometimes used to flavor meat dishes, and it could even be sprinkled over vegetables. Imagine sitting at the table with a dish of sweetened fruit sitting before you, figs, apples, and dates, all glazed with a thick, sugary syrup. But even sweeter, and perhaps a bit stranger, were the sugar-coated confections that appeared during special feasts. These confections were often made from a mixture of sugar and nuts, creating an intense sugary crunch that was unlike anything we'd recognize today. But while these sweets might sound indulgent, they were still limited to those who had the means to procure such luxuries. The average person, even if they managed to get their hands on honey, wouldn't have had the resources to enjoy sugary treats on a regular basis. Historians still debate whether medieval sweets were a luxury item for the rich, or if they were also part of a broader cultural and religious tradition. Some argue that sweet foods were reserved for religious feasts, as they were believed to have spiritual significance. Others believe that sweets were simply a way to elevate an already extravagant meal, adding to the sense of abundance and celebration. Whatever the case, it's clear that the medieval sweet tooth was far from simple. It was an indulgence wrapped in layers of social, religious, and economic significance. But while the sweet tooth of the rich was indulged with honey and sugar, the common folk often had to make do with simpler treats. Nuts, dried fruits, and even sweetened bread were the go-to desserts for the lower classes. And yet, these humble sweets still had a certain charm, particularly when shared around a communal table. The way that food brought people together during medieval feasts wasn't just about the quantity or extravagance of what was served. It was about the sense of community and shared experience that these meals provided. As we move forward from the sugary indulgence of medieval feasts, let's dive into something even more fundamental: the grains and bread that form the backbone of medieval diets. We'll explore how something as simple as bread could differ wildly between the rich and the poor, and how it shaped the meals of an entire era. The final remnants of the sweet course are cleared away, and now your attention shifts to a far simpler yet essential part of the meal: the bread. Medieval bread wasn't just something you grabbed to fill up your plate, it was the very foundation of the medieval diet. Whether you were a wealthy noble or a struggling peasant, bread was, without a doubt, the staple of every meal. But don't imagine the soft, airy loaves of today. Medieval bread was a dense, hearty creation, often heavy with grains and occasionally rougher than what you might expect. For the nobility, bread was a symbol of both status and quality. Fine, white bread made from refined wheat was considered the highest form of bread and was often served at banquets and feasts. This bread was reserved for the upper class, and for them it was a symbol of luxury. White bread was so coveted that it was often considered a mark of sophistication. But the bread of the peasants? It couldn't have been more different. The common folk typically had access only to coarser, darker loaves made from barley, rye, or oats. These breads were much denser and less palatable, often made with whatever grain was available to them. In fact, some medieval bread had a reputation for being so hard and dry that it would often have to be soaked in soup or stew to make it edible. But bread wasn't just about the type of grain. It also had practical uses in the medieval kitchen. For example, many medieval meals were served with large, thick slices of bread used as a kind of plate. These slices of bread would absorb the juices of the meat or soup they were served with, and once the meal was finished, the bread was discarded or eaten. In a way, medieval bread was both a vessel and a meal all in one. This practice, known as trencher bread, was particularly common among the wealthy, as they could afford the luxury of large loaves of bread that were almost as much a part of the meal as the food itself. While bread was a constant in the medieval diet, grains were also incredibly important. Without them, many people would have gone hungry. Grains like barley, oats, and rye were common, especially in colder regions of Europe where wheat didn't grow as well. These grains were used to make not only bread but also porridge, a staple dish in medieval kitchens. Porridge could be sweetened with honey or fruit, or it could be served plain, depending on what ingredients were available. Either way, it was a humble dish, one that filled the stomachs of the poor and the wealthy alike. Historians still argue about the quality and nutrition of medieval bread. Was the coarse, heavy bread of the peasants healthier than the white bread of the nobles? Or did the lack of refining actually make the bread more difficult to digest? Some even suggest that the refined white bread of the upper classes wasn't as nutritious as its darker counterparts, leading to debates about the health impacts of medieval diets. But one thing is clear, bread was the cornerstone of every meal, from the rich man's feast to the peasant's meager supper. Bread, and by extension, grains, also played a role in medieval society that went beyond sustenance. It was often used in religious rituals and served as an offering. In the Christian tradition, for instance, the act of breaking bread symbolized communion with God. Bread wasn't just food, it was a symbol of life, of community, and of spiritual nourishment. It had layers of meaning beyond its use as a simple foodstuff. As we leave behind the world of medieval grains and bread, we now turn to a much more curious aspect of medieval dining, the utensils. The question on everyone's mind is, how did medieval people eat without the luxury of forks and knives as we know them today? Next, we'll explore the fascinating and somewhat puzzling habits of medieval diners when it came to laying the table and the odd tools they used to consume their meals. As the bread course fades into memory, you sit back in your chair, looking at the table in front of you. One thing stands out: the lack of utensils. You might be used to seeing forks, knives, and spoons at your modern table, but in medieval times, the setup was much simpler, and for many, far messier. Imagine trying to eat your meal using just your hands, or, at most, a knife that was often shared with everyone at the table. While the nobility might have enjoyed a more refined approach, eating in the Middle Ages was often a communal and hands-on experience. You might be surprised to learn that forks, as we know them, didn't make an appearance in Europe until the 11th century, and even then, they were rare. For the most part, the medieval table was set with only a knife and a spoon, no forks in sight. The knife was an essential tool for cutting everything from bread to meat, and it was often used for everything else in the meal. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of a dedicated utensil for each part of the meal. The spoon, on the other hand, was mostly reserved for eating liquids, soups, stews, and porridge. But these weren't like the spoons we have today. They were usually made from wood, bone, or sometimes metal, and were often simple, unadorned tools that got the job done without much fuss. If you were sitting at a feast in the Middle Ages, you'd probably find that most of your eating was done with your hands, especially when it came to bread. The bread was not just food, it was part of the meal itself. You'd tear off a piece of bread, use it to scoop up meat or vegetables, and then, if it was really good, eat the bread after it had soaked up all the flavors. The bread was a multi-purpose tool, much like a plate or even a napkin. But it wasn't just about practicality. Eating with your hands was also part of the ritual of sharing the meal with others. There was something communal about everyone eating together, each person taking a piece of bread, tearing it apart, and enjoying the food in a group setting. And then there's the etiquette of medieval dining. Picture this, a large hall filled with people, all eating their food in their own way. Some people might be sitting at a table with their family, while others might be standing in a more informal, chaotic feast. There were no carefully laid out rules for who ate first or in what order, and the notion of polite table manners was very different. But that doesn't mean that eating wasn't serious business. Nobles and kings often had strict rules about dining, especially when it came to the preparation of the meal and the behavior at the table. Everything from the placement of food to the way a dish was served had deep cultural significance. For instance, the serving of meat in specific ways, whole, with eyes intact, was not only a symbol of wealth, but also a way to display the skill of the cook and the quality of the food. But what about the common folk? How did they eat their meals? For the peasants, meals were much less ceremonial. With fewer resources, they ate from simple bowls and didn't have the luxury of well-prepared feasts. They often shared a communal bowl of soup or stew, and everyone ate together, using their hands or spoons, depending on the dish. Eating together in this way wasn't just practical, it was an important part of community life, and it helped strengthen bonds within families and villages. It was, in many ways, the precursor to the family dinner table we know today. Historians still argue whether the lack of utensils in medieval times was a matter of practicality or a reflection of social and cultural norms. Some suggest that the absence of forks and other utensils was a sign of a less refined society, while others argue that it was simply a practical approach to eating that was shaped by the available technology and materials of the time. Either way, the medieval table was a far cry from the neatly organized, utensil-filled places we sit down to today. As we wrap up our look at the medieval eating habits, it's time to turn our attention to the drinks that accompanied these meals. Yes, the beverages in the Middle Ages were as important as the food itself, and there's more to medieval drinking than just wine and ale. In our next section, we'll dive into the world of medieval beverages, from the beer consumed by children to the wines and meads enjoyed by the upper classes. As the remnants of your medieval meal settle, your attention shifts to the next course of the evening, the drinks. The medieval table was never without a hearty goblet of wine, a tankard of ale, or, if you were really lucky, a unique local concoction that was far more exotic than anything we have today. But here's the twist. Medieval drinking wasn't quite what you might expect. Sure, wine and ale were staples for the upper classes, but even the children were sipping on a form of beer. The distinction between the drinks consumed by the elite and the common folk couldn't be more stark. First, let's talk about ale. If you were a medieval peasant, your drink of choice wasn't just a refreshing glass of water. It was likely a mug of ale, and it wasn't always the strong, bitter brew we think of today. Medieval ale was often lower in alcohol, brewed to be more of a nutritious drink than a potent one, This was because clean water was hard to come by. In many medieval towns, water was contaminated, making it a risky choice for drinking. Ale, on the other hand, was fermented, which killed off harmful bacteria. Drinking beer wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. You could count on it to hydrate you and provide some much-needed calories, especially if your diet was primarily bread and porridge. But the consumption of ale didn't stop with the common folk. The nobility enjoyed their ale too, though they often had the luxury of better ingredients and more refined brewing techniques. Ale, like most things in the medieval world, was a symbol of status. The finest ales were brewed with imported spices like ginger, cinnamon, and cloves. These were lavish additions, a way to show off one's wealth and access to far-flung trade routes. But even so, wine was still the drink of choice for the wealthier classes, particularly in regions like France and Italy, where vineyards were plentiful. Speaking of wine, let's move on to the kinds of wines that medieval aristocrats were drinking. Medieval wine was very different from the fine, aged wines we enjoy today. Wine in the Middle Ages was often a bit harsh, with a strong, sour taste. This was due to the lack of modern winemaking techniques, which meant that medieval wines could sometimes be unpleasantly acidic. But that didn't stop the nobles from drinking it by the barrel. Wine was consumed at almost every meal, often served in large goblets. It wasn't just about the drink itself, it was about showing off. A large, ornate wine goblet made of silver or gold was a symbol of your wealth and refinement. It wasn't just a beverage, it was a statement. And then there's the world of mead, a drink made from fermented honey. This drink was especially popular in Northern Europe, where it was seen as a more luxurious option than ale. Mead had a strong association with feasts and celebrations. Imagine a large banquet hall filled with the sound of clinking goblets as mead flowed freely, its sweet and aromatic flavors setting the tone for the evening. Mead wasn't just for the elite, it was enjoyed at all levels of society, though the quality of the mead varied greatly. The best mead was sweet and smooth, while lower quality meads could be harsh and overpowering. Now, what about the poor? What did they drink? For many peasants, the drink of choice was a simple, watered-down version of ale, sometimes mixed with herbs for added flavor. But for those living in rural areas, it was common to drink something even simpler: water, straight from the nearest stream or well. Of course, the quality of the water was often questionable, leading many to drink only small sips at a time, using their ale or wine as a more reliable source of hydration. Historians still debate how common it was for children to drink alcohol in the Middle Ages. Was it really the norm for medieval children to sip ale from a young age? Some scholars argue that it was just a part of daily life, while others claim it was more of a cultural oddity. Regardless, it's clear that alcohol was an integral part of medieval society, and it was consumed by people of all ages and social statuses. For the common folk, it was essential to survival. For the wealthy, it was a way to display wealth and indulge in the pleasures of life. As we leave behind the world of medieval beverages, we turn our focus to the poor. While the rich dined on extravagant meats, spices, and fine wines, the everyday folk had a very different reality. In the next section, we'll take a look at the struggles of the lower class and what they really ate to survive in a world where food was often scarce. As the final drops of mead and ale are drained from your cup, you shift your gaze to the other side of the medieval spectrum, where the poor sat hunched over their meager meals. The contrast is stark. While the aristocracy indulged in roasts, pastries, and wines, the common folk had to make do with scraps. The reality of their meals was far less glamorous, and for many, food was a daily struggle, often just enough to stave off hunger. Imagine you're sitting in a dimly lit cottage, the hearth crackling nearby. There's no grand banquet table here, just a rough wooden table, worn from years of use. In front of you, a bowl of porridge steams made from barley or oats, with a dollop of whatever fat or grease could be scraped together. This is a far cry from the golden meats and honey desserts you've just seen. Porridge, usually the staple of the peasant diet, could be eaten sweetened with fruits or honey on rare occasions, or simply served plain with salt. But most of the time, it was just a basic, bland affair, cheap, filling, and not much else. Bread, while vital, was no longer a luxury for peasants. The bread they ate was often dark and coarse, made from rye, barley, or oats instead of the fine wheat favored by the nobility. It was dense, heavy, and often stale. But for many, it was a vital source of calories, even if it wasn't the most pleasant thing to eat. This bread was often soaked in the same bowl of stew or soup, giving it a bit of flavor, but not much else. These meals might have seemed like an endless cycle of the same few ingredients: bread, gruel, root vegetables, and whatever scraps they could find. The idea of feasting on roasted venison or swan was as far from their reality as could be. But there were some things that set these meals apart, in ways that may surprise you. For instance, peasants had access to a wide variety of root vegetables. Carrots, onions, leeks, and turnips were staples in their diet. However, these vegetables were often the result of hard labor and backbreaking work in the fields. They weren't just food. They were a sign of survival, an essential part of the diet that kept people going. Even so, the food they ate was often poor in nutrition, lacking the variety and richness that the higher classes had at their disposal. For many, this lack of nutrients led to illnesses, malnutrition, and weakened immune systems. Still, there was one thing the poor could count on: the ability to stretch what little food they had. You could take a small piece of meat, perhaps left over from a noble's feast, and turn it into a stew, adding whatever vegetables, grains, and legumes you had on hand. These stews might not have been as grand or exotic as the ones eaten by the rich, but they were practical, filling, and affordable. The key was making the most of what was available, which wasn't much. For the peasant, food was not about indulgence. It was about survival. Historians still debate the actual quantity and quality of food consumed by the poor in medieval times. Some argue that, while the diet was lacking in variety, it wasn't as nutritionally disastrous as we might imagine. Others believe that it was a constant struggle to find enough food to sustain the population, especially during times of war or poor harvests. One thing's for sure: the food they ate was shaped by their social status and the harsh realities of medieval life. The struggle for food was constant, and meals were often sparse, especially when compared to the lavish banquets of the wealthy. The question remains: how did the medieval poor get by on such a limited diet? Many of them, especially in rural areas, had to supplement their meals with whatever they could grow, forage, or catch. Foraging for wild plants, hunting small game, or even fishing provided much-needed variety in an otherwise monotonous diet. In urban areas, however, the poor relied more on communal kitchens or markets where they could purchase whatever scraps were available. It was a life of ingenuity, making the most of whatever was at hand. For many, the concept of a meal wasn't something to savor. It was a necessity, a way to get through the day and survive another round of labor. As we wrap up our look at the diets of the poor, we now turn to the other side of the coin, the medieval feasts. After all, for the wealthy, food wasn't just a means of survival. It was a grand display of power. In the next section, we'll explore the importance of feasts and fasting, and how these elaborate meals shaped the social, political, and religious life of the Middle Ages. As you finish the last remnants of the peasant's humble meal, your attention is drawn back to the lavish feasts of the rich and powerful. The stark contrast between the sparse diet of the poor and the sumptuous banquets of the nobles couldn't be more apparent. While one side of society struggled to survive, the other indulged in excess, with food as the centerpiece of their wealth and power. But this wasn't just about eating. It was about status, politics, and even religion. Imagine entering a grand hall where tables stretch as far as the eye can see, laden with roast meats, fruits, pies, and fine pastries. The air is thick with the aroma of rich stews and freshly baked bread. Servants scurry about, refilling goblets of wine and beer. This is a medieval feast, a spectacle of excess and luxury. But feasts weren't just about the food, they were deeply tied to the social and political life of the time. For the nobility, hosting a feast wasn't just an opportunity to eat. It was an opportunity to showcase their power and wealth. The more elaborate the feast, the more impressive the host. This was a world where the act of sharing a meal could solidify alliances, make or break reputations, and influence the course of history. Feasts were also a key component of medieval religious life. The church played a significant role in shaping the meals that were served. For example, during periods of fasting, such as Lent, eating meat was forbidden, and the faithful were expected to refrain from indulgence. But when fasting periods ended, feasts were held to celebrate the return to eating meat, fish, and other rich foods. These feasts were not just for enjoyment, they were seen as spiritual events. The act of feasting was often accompanied by prayers and religious rituals, meant to show gratitude for the abundance that had been given. These communal meals also helped to reinforce the power of the church and the nobility, who used the feasts to show their piety and generosity. However, despite the extravagance, medieval feasts weren't without their oddities. For example, the tradition of entremets, elaborate and often absurd dishes, became increasingly popular. Imagine a pie made from live birds, or a roasted pig with an apple in its mouth, presented in such a way that it almost seemed like a performance. These showpieces weren't meant to be eaten, but rather to astonish the guests. They were a way to showcase the creativity of the chef and the opulence of the host. Feasts were also a place of social competition. In a world where social rank was everything, food became a way to prove your worth. The wealthier you were, the more extravagant the meal you could afford to serve. The richness of your food was often a direct reflection of your status. Guests at these feasts would be seated in a very particular order, and the best dishes were always reserved for those of the highest rank. The peacock, for instance, was considered a delicacy for the elite, symbolizing the height of luxury and refinement. Serving it at a feast was a clear sign of wealth and sophistication. The nobility would also indulge in foreign luxuries, like spices and sugars, which were imported through long and dangerous trade routes, making them even more valuable. But what about the poor during feast times? While the rich were living it up, the common folk were still working the fields, doing everything they could to survive. For them, the feast was a distant dream, one that they could only witness from afar. When the feast did come, however, they were a chance for the entire community to come together. The church or local lord might host a feast to celebrate a religious event or the harvest. And while the food might not be as grand as what the nobles enjoyed, it was still an occasion to gather and share what little there was. Historians still debate the significance of feasts in medieval times. Were they purely a means for the wealthy to show off their power, or were they an essential part of medieval social life, a way to bring communities together and reinforce the structures of society? Some suggest that feasts were a form of political theater, used to solidify the power of the ruling class, while others argue that they were a reflection of medieval spirituality, an expression of gratitude for divine providence. Whatever the case, feasts were far from simple affairs. They were laden with meaning, symbolism, and, of course, food. But feasting wasn't the only food-related ritual in the medieval world. As we'll see in the next section, fasting was just as significant. For medieval people, food wasn't just about indulgence, it was about discipline and sacrifice. The act of fasting was a way to cleanse the body and soul, and in many ways, it was just as ritualistic as the feasts themselves. Now that we've seen the grand banquets and the lavish feasts that defined the lives of the medieval elite, let's take a turn and dive into something far less indulgent: the practice of fasting. In a world where food was both a symbol of wealth and a necessity for survival, fasting was an integral part of medieval life, especially for the religious. Fasting wasn't just a way to go without food, it was a spiritual act, a way to purify the body and soul and seek divine favor. Imagine yourself in the medieval period, sitting in a quiet, dimly lit chapel, perhaps after a long day of labor. Your stomach growls, reminding you that you haven't eaten since dawn. But today, you're fasting. You might be part of a religious order, or perhaps you're a devout member of the local community, observing a period of abstinence as prescribed by the church. For medieval Christians, fasting was seen as a way to humble oneself before God, to repent for sins, and to focus on spiritual growth. It wasn't just about skipping meals, it was about controlling your body's cravings and desires. Fasting was a discipline, a way to prove your devotion and cleanse your soul. During fasting periods, certain foods were completely forbidden, especially meat, which was considered a source of excess and indulgence. This included not just the usual meats like beef or pork, but even the more exotic animals that the wealthy would often feast on. But this wasn't just a time of deprivation. Fasting was also a time for the church to regulate what could and couldn't be eaten. For example, fish was often seen as an acceptable substitute for meat, despite the fact that it was still an animal product. In fact, fish was one of the most common food items served during Lent, and it was often eaten in place of meat. But the strange part? Many fish were so oily that they might as well have been considered just as heavy as meat itself. Despite the restrictions, fasting wasn't always about just going without food. For the rich, it was a time to indulge in other luxury foods, like sweet desserts or rare spices, things that weren't typically eaten in everyday meals. The church allowed certain exceptions to the rules, especially for the wealthy, who could afford to eat refined foods that would still fit within the guidelines of fasting. For the poor, however, fasting could be a far harsher reality. Without the option to enjoy sweets or rich alternatives, they often had to make do with even less during these periods. The fasts, which could last anywhere from a few days to several weeks, were a true test of endurance. Historians still debate whether fasting was truly about spiritual purification or whether it was a way for the church and the aristocracy to exert control over both the body and the masses. Was it a genuine effort to purify oneself, or was it another form of social control designed to maintain the status quo? Some scholars argue that fasting periods reinforce the class divide, with the wealthy enjoying indulgences and the poor simply struggling to survive. Others suggest that fasting was a personal, deeply spiritual act, with each person interpreting the rules and their own relationship with food in a unique way. In addition to the religious fasts, there were also times when fasting was used as a form of political protest or to mark important events in history. During times of crisis, whether it was war, plague, or famine, people would often turn to fasting as a form of solidarity or as a way to seek divine intervention. Some even used fasting as a way to protest injustice, hoping that their deprivation would lead to some sort of divine retribution against the rulers or the forces oppressing them. While fasting was a significant part of religious life, it wasn't limited to the church. The nobility also used fasting to demonstrate their piety, especially in times of social upheaval. It was another way for them to prove that they were not just wealthy and powerful, but also devout and in touch with the divine. Their ability to fast showed a form of spiritual superiority, even as they indulged in luxury and excess during the rest of the year. Fasting, then, became another tool in the medieval game of social status. As we close out our look at fasting, we can now look forward to a shift in the medieval food landscape. With the rise of the Renaissance and the subsequent changes in agriculture, society, and trade, medieval diets would begin to evolve. But before we leave the Middle Ages entirely, let's explore some of the strangest foods of this period, those that were far from the common meats and grains. In the next section, we'll dive into the bizarre, often absurd foods that the medieval world embraced, from roasted dormice to extravagant pies. Now that we've explored the practices of feasting and fasting, let's turn our attention to the truly bizarre side of medieval cuisine. You might think that after all the talk of rich meats, breads, and spices, there wouldn't be much else to surprise you. But you'd be wrong. The medieval table wasn't just filled with everyday foods. No, it was also stocked with some truly strange and exotic dishes that would make even the boldest modern foodies shudder. Imagine, if you will, a grand feast where the centerpiece is a roasted dormouse. Yes, you heard that right. Dormice, small rodents, were a prized delicacy in the medieval world, especially in Roman times, and they made their way into the kitchens of the Middle Ages. These little creatures were often stuffed with minced meat and spices before being roasted. You might find them served whole, with their tiny feet and whiskers still intact, just to prove the extravagance of the meal. For the rich, eating dormice wasn't just about taste, it was about showing off. The rarer the animal, the higher the prestige. Imagine sitting at the table, a dormouse on your plate, surrounded by guests who all knew that only the wealthiest could afford such a dish. But that wasn't the only strange thing served at medieval feasts. How about a roasted swan? This was another food that made its way onto the table of the wealthy, often presented with its feathers still intact, as a symbol of wealth and luxury. Just like the dormouse, the swan was a showpiece, something to marvel at before it was carved and eaten. Imagine the nobility sitting back, proud of their extravagant meals, as they dined on birds that would be considered absurdly extravagant today. And then there's the flamingo. Yes, the flamboyant pink bird was sometimes served at medieval banquets, and it wasn't just about impressing guests with its bright feathers. The flamingo was seen as a symbol of exoticism and rarity, much like the peacock, and it was often roasted and served whole. Its meat, often described as tender and flavorful, was considered a luxurious delicacy. To serve a flamingo at a feast wasn't just about the taste. It was about claiming access to distant lands and trade routes, to display one's wealth and social standing. But the weirdness didn't stop there. The medieval kitchen was also home to some truly outlandish pies. Take the pie of meats, for instance, a massive pastry filled with a mix of meat, spices, and sometimes even live animals. Yes, there are records of pies being made with live birds that would flap around inside the crust when the pie was cut open, offering guests a dramatic surprise as they dined. These types of pies were more than just food. They were theatrical displays meant to astonish and amuse the guests. They were part of the performance of the feast, where food and entertainment blended together. Historians still argue about why such bizarre dishes were so popular in medieval times. Some believe it was about the sheer shock value, showing off to guests and flaunting your access to rare and exotic foods. Others argue that these strange foods were symbolic, a reflection of the period's fascination with the other and the unknown. After all, the medieval period was a time of exploration, when the boundaries of the known world were constantly being pushed. The idea of serving a rare bird or an exotic animal might have been a way for the wealthy to display their connection to far-off lands, even if they never visited them. Whatever the reason, it's clear that the medieval diet was filled with foods that, by today's standards, seem utterly bizarre. From roasted dormice to live bird pies, medieval feasts were an exhibition of excess and extravagance. But they were also part of a cultural moment, a time when food wasn't just about sustenance, it was about power, prestige, and performance. As we leave behind the world of strange medieval foods, we move on to something more fundamental: medicine. It might surprise you to learn that food was often seen as medicine in the medieval world. In fact, some of the foods that were consumed during this time weren't just for nourishment. They were thought to have healing properties. In the next section, we'll explore the fascinating world of medieval food and medicine, where meals were prescribed as remedies and believed to cure everything from common colds to more serious ailments. As the last bizarre dish is cleared away, your attention turns to something that might seem even more peculiar than eating dormice or flamingos: medieval medicine. Now, you might be thinking, what does food have to do with medicine? Well, in the medieval world, food and medicine weren't as separate as they are today. In fact, food was often seen as a form of treatment for various ailments, and what you ate was believed to have a profound impact on your health and well-being. Imagine yourself in the shoes of a medieval doctor, or perhaps the more common household healer. Your medical kit likely consisted of a variety of herbs, spices, and foods, all carefully chosen for their supposed medicinal properties. Many medieval remedies involved food, and it wasn't just about eating vegetables or fruits for their vitamins. People believed that certain foods had the power to cure diseases, improve health, or even keep evil spirits away. But these treatments weren't always what we would call effective today. Some remedies were bizarre, while others might have been rooted in a mix of folklore and the limited medical knowledge of the time. Take, for instance, the use of garlic. Medieval people believed that garlic had powerful medicinal properties and could ward off everything from the plague to evil spirits. Garlic was a common ingredient in many remedies, often used to treat coughs, colds, and even digestive problems. But it didn't stop there. Garlic was also believed to have protective qualities. Placing it in a home was thought to guard against the evil eye or malevolent spirits. So, while garlic was certainly a food that found its way into the medieval diet, it also had a strong medicinal reputation. Herbs, too, played a critical role in medieval medicine. Medieval healers used herbs like sage, thyme, and mint to treat a variety of ailments. These herbs were often brewed into teas or steeped into infusions. If you were suffering from an upset stomach, you might be handed a cup of peppermint tea, and if you had a fever, a concoction of sage and thyme might be the remedy of choice. The belief in the medicinal power of herbs wasn't just based on superstition. In some cases, these herbs had real therapeutic effects, although the medical understanding behind them was limited. But not all medieval food-based remedies were based on plants or herbs. Some of the stranger treatments involve food combinations that seem outlandish today. For example, if you were feeling faint or weak, it wasn't uncommon for medieval healers to prescribe a meal made from chicken, rice, and wine, ingredients thought to restore strength. For those suffering from poor digestion, a mix of wine and honey might be recommended, as honey was believed to have both digestive and healing properties. Of course, no discussion of medieval food and medicine would be complete without mentioning the use of animal-based ingredients. Animal fats, like lard or tallow, were commonly used in a variety of treatments. For instance, a mixture of animal fat and herbs might be applied to a wound or used in an ointment to treat skin conditions. Additionally, certain meats, like lamb were thought to have specific healing properties, with some believing that eating lamb could help with blood circulation and overall vitality. However, this belief in the healing properties of meat wasn't without its contradictions. The same meat that was believed to have restorative effects was also something to be avoided during fasting periods, showing how food could be both a cure and a cause of restriction. Medieval medicine also believed in the concept of humors, the idea that a balance of four bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was essential for good health. Food played a big role in maintaining this balance. For example, if you were considered to have too much phlegm, perhaps you had a cold or a cough, you might be advised to eat spicy foods like pepper or mustard, which were thought to help dry up excess moisture in the body. Conversely, if you had too much heat, which could mean fever or an infection, you might be told to eat cooling foods like cucumbers or melons. This idea of balancing the humors with food was a central part of medieval medicine, and while it sounds strange to us today, it reflected a more holistic approach to health, one that combined diet, environment, and spiritual well-being. Historians still argue about how effective medieval food-based medicine really was. Some suggest that many of the food remedies had real benefits, especially considering the medicinal properties of herbs and spices, while others believe that these practices were largely based on superstition and trial and error. What we do know is that food was seen as an essential part of health, and many medieval people relied on food not just to nourish themselves, but also to cure themselves. As we close the chapter on medieval medicine, we move on to one final look at how food was transformed in the later stages of the Middle Ages. With the rise of new agricultural techniques and a growing interest in exotic spices and foods, the medieval diet was on the cusp of change. The next section will explore how these shifts led to new dining practices and the eventual evolution of the food we recognize today. As we leave behind the world of medieval medicine, let's turn our focus to the transitions that took place toward the end of the Middle Ages, especially the ways in which food, agriculture, and dining practices began to evolve. By this point, you might have noticed how tightly bound medieval food was to both social and spiritual life, and how much of it was governed by religious traditions. But with the rise of new agricultural techniques and increasing trade with distant lands, the medieval world was on the cusp of a profound transformation that would lead to the foods and dining habits we recognize today. Imagine yourself in the later years of the medieval period, just as the winds of change begin to stir. The once stagnant agricultural practices that defined earlier centuries are giving way to new innovations. New crops are being introduced from the east, including rice, sugarcane, and citrus fruits. These crops are not just changing what's available to eat, they are transforming the very way people think about food. For the wealthy, this means access to fresh fruits and spices that were previously reserved for the elite. But for the common folk, the introduction of new crops like rye and barley holds promise for better, more reliable harvests. As new foods arrive, the growing availability of spices and exotic ingredients begins to shift the dynamics of medieval cuisine. In the earlier Middle Ages, spices like pepper and saffron were rare luxuries, mostly reserved for the rich. But as trade routes expanded and new ports were established, spices became more accessible. No longer were these exotic flavors reserved for the kings and queens. The middle classes were beginning to experiment with flavor in ways that had never been possible before. Imagine sitting at a table with a dish of stewed lamb, now made with a rich blend of cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, spices that just a century earlier would have been unimaginable for anyone outside of the nobility. This expansion of spice use didn't just change the way food tasted, it changed the way food was viewed. As spices became more affordable, they lost some of their mystique. What was once seen as a symbol of wealth was now a regular part of cooking in many homes. Along with the spices came new ideas about food preparation. The medieval period had been marked by the tradition of stewing, roasting, and baking, methods that were simple and practical. But as wealthier families began to experiment, the techniques of cooking grew more refined. Dishes that had once been thrown together in a single pot were now carefully prepared with an eye toward presentation and balance. At the same time, the Renaissance's influence on art and culture began to extend to the table as well. Dining became more about enjoyment, not just sustenance. The feasts that had once been about showing off wealth were now about showcasing sophistication and taste. Table manners evolved, and etiquette became a serious consideration in noble circles. The use of forks, once a foreign concept, slowly made its way into European dining practices. You might find yourself sitting at a table where, for the first time, you're expected to use utensils rather than just your hands and a knife. This shift signified a broader cultural change, a move toward greater refinement, and with it, a new attitude toward food. Historians still debate whether the culinary changes at the end of the medieval period were truly revolutionary, or if they were simply the natural progression of existing practices. Some argue that the use of spices and the refinement of dining practices were part of a broader cultural awakening spurred by the Renaissance. Others suggest that these changes were the result of more practical forces, growing trade networks and agricultural advancements that made new foods more accessible to a wider range of people. Regardless of the cause, there's no denying that the medieval food landscape was rapidly evolving, setting the stage for the more modern diets that would follow. This transformation was especially noticeable in urban areas, where people were beginning to experience new types of food from all over the world. As trade grew and cities became more cosmopolitan, the kinds of meals you could find on the street or in markets began to change. No longer were people limited to the same basic staples of bread, cheese, and meat. Now, you could walk into a market and find imported spices, fruits from far-off lands, and a variety of grains that had never been available before. The diet of the medieval commoner was slowly becoming more varied, and the once static diet was beginning to resemble the more diverse food systems we know today. However, the changes weren't just about the food itself. The way people ate was also evolving. In earlier centuries, communal eating was the norm, with families and villages sharing meals from a single pot. But as new foods and cooking methods became more widespread, meals started to become more individualized. The concept of private dining began to take root, especially in urban centers, where the wealthier classes could afford the luxury of private kitchens and individual servings. This shift in dining habits marked a significant departure from the medieval tradition of communal eating. As we wrap up our journey through the food of the Middle Ages, it's clear that medieval diets were about much more than just filling the stomach. They were about social status, spirituality, and the intricacies of daily life. The feasts, the fasting, the strange foods, and the medicinal uses of food all point to the deep connection between food and the world in which it was consumed. But with the end of the medieval period came a new era of food, one that would lay the foundation for the diets of the future. As agriculture and trade expanded, the world of food began to change in ways that would forever alter the course of culinary history. As we reach the final stretch of this medieval culinary journey, it's time to reflect on how the foods of the Middle Ages eventually gave way to the dining practices of the Renaissance and beyond. The Middle Ages, with all its feasts, fasts, strange dishes, and medicinal foods, were marked by a series of transitions, agricultural, social, and cultural, that ultimately set the stage for the way we eat today. Imagine stepping into a kitchen at the dawn of the Renaissance. The world is changing quickly, and with it, the food culture is evolving. The familiar medieval staples, bread, meat, and simple stews, are being transformed by new ideas. With the expansion of trade, Europe is beginning to experience an influx of new ingredients, and the once rare spices, sugar, and fruits are now becoming more widely available. As a result, the way people approach food begins to shift. The medieval mindset, where food was deeply entwined with spiritual practices and survival, gives way to a more pleasure-driven, exploration-based approach to dining. One of the most significant changes during this period was the growing use of sugar, once reserved for the nobility and used primarily for medicinal purposes. Sugar is now being incorporated into everyday diets, making its way into pastries, cakes, and even savory dishes. The sweet tooth of the medieval elite, previously satisfied with honey and fruit, now expands to include a whole new realm of sugar-based treats. And let's not forget the impact of new fruits, such as citrus and exotic berries, which were imported through expanding trade routes. These fruits, once a rarity, are now available for the wealthy to enjoy, and they soon make their way into pies and other sweet dishes. But the shift wasn't just about the food itself. It was about how people ate. With the rise of private dining in wealthier households, the formalized meal becomes more structured. No longer were diners eating out of large communal bowls, passing bread and meat around the table. Instead, each person now had their own plate, and meals were served in courses. The Renaissance ushered in the idea of the banquet, a multi-course meal that would go on for hours, each course more elaborate than the last. This was a departure from the medieval feasts, where the food was served all at once, and guests were expected to pick and choose what they wanted from the spread. As private dining became more prevalent, etiquette and table manners also began to take shape. This was the time when people started using forks regularly, something unthinkable during the Middle Ages when eating with your hands was the norm. The introduction of forks alongside knives and spoons marked a significant cultural shift. The formalized dining table, complete with utensils and separate courses, became a status symbol in itself, signaling that you had embraced the finer, more refined ways of living. Historians still debate the exact timeline of these changes. Was the Renaissance's focus on refinement and luxury just a natural progression of the changes that began in the late Middle Ages, or was it the result of deeper, more deliberate cultural shifts? Some argue that these changes were the result of a growing interest in humanism and the rediscovery of classical Roman and Greek ideas, which brought with them a more focused approach to food and dining. Others suggest that the expansion of trade and the rise of capitalism played a more significant role, providing access to new ingredients and creating a class of people who could afford to indulge in these luxuries. Regardless of the cause, it's clear that by the time the Middle Ages came to an end, the food landscape had begun to evolve in a way that would set the stage for modern eating habits. The influence of the Middle Ages remained, especially in the continued popularity of certain foods like bread, meat, and stews. But it was being transformed by new ideas, new ingredients, and new ways of enjoying food. And here we are, at the end of our medieval food journey. As we drift into the future, we leave behind a world of feasts, fasting, strange foods, and deep-rooted customs. We've explored how medieval people used food not just to nourish their bodies, but to show power, prove faith, and connect with their communities. We've seen how their meals were shaped by their social standing, religious beliefs, and the limited resources available to them. And as we say goodbye to the Middle Ages, we acknowledge how the foods and practices of this period laid the groundwork for the complex and diverse food culture we know today. Now, as you let the imagery of these meals fade away, remember the medieval table wasn't just a place to eat. It was a reflection of the times, the culture, and the people who shaped the world. So, as we settle into a quiet night, perhaps think of the simple, humble meals that medieval people ate and how much those foods shaped the world of taste we inhabit today.